Father Knows Best is the 10th episode of the Tortellis. This is directed by Charlotte Brown, and it's a really good episode. It's all about Nick and what he thinks a man should be like. It starts off with Nick telling Charlotte she should just get a man to take care of her like he takes care of Loretta. And immediately after, Anthony is behind him ironing his clothes, which Nick does not think is a job that Anthony should be doing. He thinks that Annie should be doing this. And then Annie's going to take a bubble bath while Anthony is then going to go and make the bed. And to begin with, it did seem like Anthony was doing all of the chores, but then Charlotte pointed out that Annie was up on the roof fixing the TV antenna recently. So actually, it does seem pretty weighted. And Nick is realising, in his opinion, that he was an absent father, and that's why Anthony doesn't know what it is to be, in Nick's eyes, a real man. And it was a sweet moment where Nick was kind of realising to himself that he wasn't there for Anthony in ways he wanted to be. And it was a good moment of realisation, albeit because of a pretty disgusting attitude. And he asked Anthony, he realises he needs to spend more time with him and to teach him how to be, in his eyes, a man. And he asks Anthony if he wanted to do something tonight, and Anthony was genuinely so excited that his father wanted to do something with him, just one-on-one, just the two of them. They're going to go bowling. It really showed not just how much Anthony liked Nick and wanted to be around his father, which I feel like generally was an impression I had anyway, but also the fact that this is not something Nick does that often. And he's not, even when he's there with Anthony, he's not present. And that really showed in that moment. However, Nick became not great again. And admittedly, Annie wasn't that great either. There will be spoilers from now as I explain what happens in the rest of the episode. But Annie and Anthony had been saving money for a stereo, but Annie realised she wanted to have this honeymoon suite and a romantic night in this hotel, and that's how she wanted to spend the money. And Anthony did initially say, but we were saving for the stereo. And then they basically, Annie decided, Anthony agreed that they'd do what Annie wanted. And once she left, Nick told Anthony that he has lost control of the marriage, which I think is not a great way to look at it. And even obviously today, that's a terrible attitude. But even at the time, I can see that this attitude isn't great because Nick is not giving off a lot of positive ideas here. And his idea that the man should control the marriage and the finances, especially when he's not the one earning all of the money. We know that Annie goes out to earn money, so it's not like it's just Anthony's money from working with his father. But as I said, Annie shouldn't have just thought of her needs because Anthony did want the stereo. That is what they were saving for. So to then turn around and dictate they use the money for something else isn't great. They should have had a better conversation than just doing what Annie wanted. So I can understand Nick's point slightly, but his phrasing definitely wasn't great. And we have a scene a little later on where Nick reminds Anthony of this, and Anthony decides to put his foot down and say they're getting the stereo. And Annie says she hates him and storms out and never wants to see him again. And again, I don't blame Anthony for being annoyed that the money wasn't being used for what they'd intended it for. But I also think Annie kind of flew off the handle a lot. I feel like, again, the conversation could have gone much better, and it seems like Annie's moving out for good. And then we have this brilliant scene, and Loretta was amazing. Every now and then, Loretta will say something that's really great. She comes across as being a bit of an airhead, but sometimes she's quite wise. And she was in this moment, as she pointed out that actually Anthony had stood up to Nick, because ultimately he ended up going with Annie and saying, it's not worth the fight, my marriage is more important than the stereo. And Nick hated that. He absolutely hated it. And Loretta pointed out to Nick that Anthony stood up to you, and that might be something you're proud of. And Nick realised that, and I don't say this often, but Loretta was right. And we have this really sweet scene at the end between Nick and Anthony, and Nick apologizes and they make amends. And then Anthony says, "I love you, Dad." And I was waiting for Nick to say it back. He didn't, but he was being affectionate in his own way. And then at the very end, Mark comes in because he wasn't allowed to watch cartoons, and Nick swoops him up and sits him on his lap. And I don't want to say he got a second chance at being a father, but it was kind of like he had realised in the episode that he hadn't been the best role model. He hadn't been there for Anthony. And here is little Mark coming to him for not necessarily advice, just to vent about the fact he wasn't allowed to watch cartoons. And Nick could at least be there for him right now. And he was. And it was beautiful. A really sweet episode. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. Only 3 left, I think. Not too many to go now. Really, really thoroughly enjoyed this series more than I thought I would. But more on that later. For now, Father Knows Best is a pretty decent episode of the Tortellis.